This is one of a series of lectures created to introduce you to important principles of ethics. I am Barry Penn-Hollar, Professor of Religion and Philosophy at Shenandoah University, and I have prepared these lectures for use in ethics courses at Shenandoah. Many people use the words ethics and morality interchangeably as if they mean the same thing. So an ethical value and a moral value are the same. Those of us who have been trained in the field of ethics, I think, generally use the language somewhat differently. For us, and as I will use the language in this course, ethics means simply critical and systematic reflection on morality. Ethics is the academic discipline that studies morality or the moral life. Morality is a bit more complicated, and the moral life itself is fairly complex. But for our purposes here, it's sufficient to understand that morality involves our beliefs and judgments about three things: conduct, on what conduct is right, what conduct is wrong. That applies to individual conduct and as well as the policies and practices of institutions. So we make judgments and have beliefs about conduct. We also have beliefs and make judgments about character, what a good person is or a bad person is. And finally, we have beliefs about what we might call the ends, goals, and purposes of life, or what defines the qualities of a good and happy life. The moral life involves all that. Now, our focus in this class will be almost entirely on right and wrong conduct. Let me return to the definition of ethics and say a bit about what I mean by ethics as critical reflection. The first thing to be aware of is I'm not using the word critical here in the way we ordinarily use it, that is, as finding fault. Rather, what I mean is careful and systematic analysis and the making of thoughtful judgments about morality. That may mean finding fault, but it may not mean that at all. You might think of critics, movie critics or music critics. They sometimes say, in fact often say, very, very wonderful things about the movies they review or the music they review. Sometimes they say bad things or critical things. But to be critical in this sense means simply to carefully and systematically analyze and make judgments about something, and in this case about the moral life. The second thing to be said is that critical reflection on morality involves becoming aware of multiple perspectives. That is to say, becoming aware that there may be more than one way to think about some moral issue, or more than one reasonable and credible moral judgment that people make about difficult moral matters. So becoming a critical thinker means becoming aware and able to analyze and compare and then finally make judgments about different perspectives and approaches. The third thing it's important to say is that gaining a critical perspective or coming to have a critical perspective on morality means making oneself, one's own moral life, one's own beliefs and judgments about conduct, character, and the ends and purposes of life, making all that the object of one's reflection. It means achieving some critical distance, we might say, over against oneself. And rather than just assuming that what one thinks and the judgments one makes are valid and true and good, one steps back from those and thinks carefully, critically about yourself and your own morality, your own moral judgments and beliefs. I've said that the moral life involves judgments about conduct or human action, judgments as to whether actions are right or wrong. Well, the truth of the matter is the issue is a bit more complicated than that, for in fact we make more careful judgments than simply right and wrong. Particularly, we may mean a variety of things when we say that an action is right. So, for example, we might say that an action is right, and what we mean is simply that it is permissible, that it's not wrong to do the action. So consider the case of Mrs. Jones, who has found herself terminally ill while pregnant. And she's contemplating whether or not to have surgery that will save her life, but destroy her fetus. We might say that it would be right for her to have the surgery, and mean simply that it would be permissible for her to have the surgery. Now, if we say that, we're committed to also saying it'd be permissible for her not to have the surgery. But that would be one type of judgment, one thing we might mean if we said it was right for her to have the surgery, simply that it was permissible, not wrong. Consider also Khalil, who has some extra cash in hand, and he's contemplating whether to throw a party, give to the soup kitchen that serves homeless people, or start a savings account. Some people would say that any of those actions would be permissible in his case. It would be right for him to throw the party, it would be right for him to give to the soup kitchen, or right to start a savings account. But meaning it would be okay, it would be permissible, allowable for him to do any of those things. Now, a much stronger judgment that we might mean when we say that something is right is that the action is obligatory. It must be done. So again, think of Mrs. Jones. Some might argue that Mrs. Jones is in fact obligated not to have the surgery because it will destroy her fetus. Of course, somebody else might say that she's in fact obligated to have the surgery because it's necessary to save her life and enable her to continue to fulfill her obligations to her husband and other children. But the point here is these would be much stronger judgments. Not that having the surgery or not having the surgery is permissible, but that one or the other is in fact an obligation. In thinking about Khalil, some might argue that the poor and homeless have a right to shelter, in which case they might come to the conclusion that Khalil is in fact obligated, if he has extra cash, to give it to the soup kitchen that serves the homeless shelter. That's not merely permissible. He really should do that. And of course, there is another category of right action, which is called supererogation. Some people would say that certain acts are supererogatory, which is to say they are not obligations, they're not things we must do. They are things rather that go above and beyond the call of duty, or above and beyond obligation. Again, think of Mrs. Jones. Some people would say that she may have the surgery and save her life, though it would destroy her fetus, or she may decide to save the fetus and not save her own life. Either of those are permissible, but would find it praiseworthy for her to forego the surgery, not have the surgery, and in fact giving her life for the sake of her fetus. A supererogatory act, a praiseworthy act, but not one that she was obligated to do. Similarly, I think many people would say the same thing about Khalil giving his money to the soup kitchen. He's not required to do it, but we would surely honor and praise him if he did. So the overall point here is that this matter of right and wrong is more complicated than that language suggests. In fact, when we say that an action is right, we might mean merely that it is permissible, we might mean that it is obligatory, or we might mean that it is supererogatory, going above and beyond the call of duty. When I ask you to make judgments in particular cases, you should be clear as what you mean when you say that a particular action is right. So throughout this course, we will be considering judgments about right and wrong conduct or right and wrong action. I'll be asking you to make judgments. And we will be using 5 fundamental principles to help us think about these matters. The principles are listed here. Non-maleficence, which means do no harm or don't act in ways that hurt people. Beneficence, act in ways that make people better off, help them. Autonomy, don't interfere with people's liberty by coercing or manipulating them. Fidelity, keep your promises. Live up to the people's legitimate expectations of you based on commitments you've made or roles you're playing. And finally, justice. Treat people fairly. Respect their dignity. We'll be using these 5 principles. Now, one question you might have is, what about moral rules? Or what's the difference between a principle and a rule? Both are action guiding statements. Both are things that tell us what to do or tell us something about how we ought to act or conduct ourselves. But here's how I understand the difference. A moral principle is simply a general statement about how people ought to act individually and collectively or institutionally. But a rule is a more specific statement. And we can understand our rules as being derived from moral principles or a specification of those moral principles. So, for example, I will argue that our idea or the rule that's against lying is actually derived from our commitment to autonomy. When we lie, we manipulate people to believe or act the way we want them to act, rather than letting them act the way they would if they knew the truth. So lying, or the rule against lying, is derived from, or a specification of, our commitment to respecting people's liberty. So this concludes your first brief iMovie. I hope you find it helpful. I hope you see these lectures, presentations, as helping you develop the critical apparatus that you will need to engage in the discipline of ethics, critical reflection on the moral life. Next time, I'll talk more about some of the underlying convictions behind the 5 principles we will be using in this course.